Okay. Um, the title of my presentation is called Disgust Distributed Public Shaming and the New Epideictic. So I became interested in this topic during the fall when I noticed an incident involving this woman. So if you're familiar with Twitter, you may recognize that this was a photo posted to Twitter via Instagram, actually. Beneath it is a retweet or reposting from a different user called RT Douchebags. The hashtags beneath the photo pretty much tell you the story here. This woman, whose name it turns out is Alicia Ann Lynch, dressed as a Boston Marathon runner for Halloween. So you can tell from her pose that she thinks it's pretty funny. She's proud of herself for this. And you can guess from the scene behind her that she's at work. But it soon became clear to Lynch and everyone else with access to social media that a lot of people did not find this costume very funny. In fact, the reaction to this costume was swift, far-reaching, and censorious, along with thousands of tweets condemning her actions. Lynch, her family, and her friends also got death threats, threats of rape, and other, wishes that she would die in a fire or kill herself immediately. And ultimately, the backlash ended up costing her job. So Lynch's case was one in a series of incidents of spontaneous collective public shamings via social media that have happened recently. So many that Salon.com called 2013 the year in high profile firings. So here are a couple more examples. Lindsay Stone was fired from her job for this kind of silly photo. It's hard to tell why people would get so mad about this, but she took this in front of a sign in Arlington National Cemetery. So somebody decided that she was being disrespectful, created a Facebook page called Fire Lindsay Stone, and which accumulated tons of likes, and eventually her employer got so nervous that they ended up firing her, indeed. So Justine Sacco was probably one of, you might not have heard of her, but she was probably one of the biggest firings of this year. She sent this unfortunate tweet: "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white," which somebody explained later was kind of a dark joke that was recognizing her white privilege, but of course, if you see it, it looks just completely racist, and you can see why people would be mad at it. But what made this case worse is that she tweeted this immediately before she got on an international flight from London to South Africa, and so she didn't have internet access for 12 hours. And in the meantime, the world went nuts. In fact, one story called this "the tweet heard round the world." Somebody started a hashtag on Twitter called "Has Justine Landed Yet?" And everybody went nuts. And she also lost her job, which ironically enough was she was the head of PR for a large media firm. So she obviously has bad Twitter skills. Anyway, so and I just actually saw this morning on Facebook something about the hashtag cancel Colbert. Apparently Stephen Colbert made a joke on a show that some people interpreted as racist, and now they're all up in arms about him too. So the villagers are coming with their pitchforks. Okay, so anyway, all of this is just to say that these spontaneous collective public shamings have become a significant phenomenon. And as a rhetorician, I am especially interested in tracing how communication is changing with the evolution of technologies. And what I want to argue today is that these acts of spontaneous public shaming that we're seeing are a new form of a very old kind of rhetoric. And what Aristotle first termed epideictic, which he defined as the rhetoric of praise and blame. So common forms of epideictic include speeches on ceremonial occasions, like toasts and eulogies. Epideictic is one of Aristotle's three divisions of rhetoric, along with judicial rhetoric, which judges past actions, and deliberative rhetoric, which has to do with creating policy, so it's future actions. Unlike the other two, epideictic isn't a practical workaday rhetoric, so for a long time it was considered to be quite frivolous. It's only recently that people have started to reconsider the function of epideictic. Now theorists believe that it's actually the most fundamental sort of rhetoric because it has to do with affirming and cementing the values, beliefs, and norms of a community. But our definitions of what counts as epideictic haven't changed much. By and large, we still think of it as basically like this. A confined rhetorical act, a single rhetor speaking or writing to an audience. So what I want to argue is what we're seeing in these contemporary acts of public shaming is a new form of epideictic. This form of epideictic does not rely on an interaction between a single speaker and audience. Rather, it is particulated, distributed, accretive, and performative. Epideictic still affirms and creates the values and norms of a community, but these values and norms are crystallized in massive parallel across many different users and on differing technological platforms. And in articulating this new form of epideictic, I also want to explore the often overlooked role of affect in epideictic rhetoric. Examining how these public shamings work, I argue, can tell us a great deal about how social media networks enable the production and transmission of affect, and how that in turn creates a community. So first, let's talk about shame. Okay, shame is one of the most social of emotions. You are shamed or you feel shame because of others. Without a social structure, it's probably safe to say that shame wouldn't exist. So obviously, shaming is nothing new. Here are two historically recognizable instances of shaming. One fictional, Hester Prynne from The Scarlet Letter. And the second one is an image from the so-called ugly carnivals that happened after the liberation of France, where women accused of la collaboration horizontale, basically sleeping with Nazis, were subjected to public head shaving. However, because public shaming requires a community to work, instances of public shaming died down once people started becoming more mobile. Obviously, if you can hop a train or a plane and start a different life in another town, or conversely, if you live in a bedroom community and don't know your neighbors, then public shaming loses effect. It becomes meaningless. But suddenly, community is back in a different way. Because communication on the internet leaves traces via Google search results, etc., suddenly public shaming is effective again. So it becomes a tool for mob justice, or what has been called by some the Internet Vigilante Army. So as you can see, I did a Google search today, and these are the results that come up for Alicia Ann Lynch. Some nude photos that she had posted on a Tumblr site that some enterprising Twitter users during the whole Boston Marathon kerfuffle found and helpfully collated for people. And some more results that talk about what happened. So clearly, 6 months later, this is still the top results. Okay. So What affective reactions, we might ask, are behind the urge to shame others? Shame is one sort of affect, and we'll talk about that in a second. But really, what we're interested in here are the shamers, the people behind the shaming. So, what are the feelings of the shamers? Well, thanks to the internet, we can get a sense of the affective reactions that underlie public shaming events because traces of it are left behind, as you can see. So we can see here that a lot of the language used is the language of disgust. Indeed, in his book, The Anatomy of Disgust, William Ian Miller makes the connection between shame and disgust, pairing them as linked affects. Moral disgust or contempt on one person's part produces shame in another. Miller writes, actions of our own that should shame us, styles of self-presentation that should humiliate us if we are socially competent enough to recognize our ineptitudes and failings, are those actions and styles that generate and justify the contempt, even the disgust of others for us. Disgust, which literally means bad taste, is a physical and affective reaction that both affects and serves to reveal borders of the inside and outside of the body and of culture and biology. Evolutionary psychologist Jonathan Haidt and his co-authors explain disgust as a product of the omnivore's dilemma. Whereas humans gain flexibility and freedom from having a wide-ranging possibility of foods they might consume, the same flexibility also increases the possibility of consuming toxins or bad food. The affective reaction of disgust, therefore, has been evolutionarily critical to human well-being. We react with disgust when we do or think about eating something bad, of breaching the bodily envelope and allowing pollution in. Initially, such pollution may have been only of the physical sort, but because disgust is such a powerful tool for discernment, it tends to leak beyond its primary function of keeping the inside of the body pure. This happens through the tool of pre-adaptation, or the evolutionary repurposing of an already existing system to meet new needs. Thus, Haidt et al. Say, core disgust may have been pre-adapted as a rejection system, easily harnessed to other kinds of rejection. Humans decide what can be safely incorporated into the body, as well as what can be accepted into the borders of individuality or self. So these faces that are shown here in this slide show both a physical form of disgust, so the tongue sticking out, the tongue being a sort of liminal aspect between the inside and the outside of the body, and then the other faces are meant to represent more moral disgust. So this primal reinforcement of internal and external boundaries, though, is culturally specific. What is disgusting for members of one culture, eating insects, for instance, is ordinary and accepted for another. Haidt et al. Argue that culturally specific disgust is rooted in different philosophical conceptions of the individual. Disgust, the authors say, guards against different threats to different selves. For instance, the Japanese, who are generally less concerned with degradations to the individual self per se, but who place great cultural emphasis on interdependence, describe as disgusting things that violate social interconnectedness, like everyday social interactions that go awry. I don't have to really read that quote. Americans are disgusted by a very different set of things. Owing to the American obsessive emphasis on rights, and the more general Western conception of the body as an individualized temple or machine, Americans find disgusting anything that violates, quote, the fragile dignity of the individual, end quote, including things like senseless murders, as well as people who strip others of their dignity, including racists, rapists, and child abusers. So say the authors. I would also add abortionists. Lauren Berlant has a great article called The Subject of True Feeling that talks about how the image of the fetus has become sort of the ultimate American subject. So that's for another time. But these concerns perhaps give us some insight into why people reacted so strongly to Alicia Ann Lynch. Terrorism, like the Boston Marathon bombings, is seen as a particularly heinous example of violating individual rights, the right to conduct business in public places without being maimed or killed. The people who were killed and injured in the bombings were considered by Americans to be innocents, at least they weren't at war, especially as several anti-Lynch tweets made clear since a child was among the victims. So for Lynch to be seen as mocking this event amounts to a violation of these rights by proxy. Hence the reactions of disgust, I argue. Okay, and this, I'm not really sure what to do with this yet, but as an interesting aside, the characteristic feeling of shame, like disgust, also has to do with the borders of the individual. Shame becomes manifest at the borders of the individual, something that is evident in its etymology. The Indo-European root of the word shame is skam or skem, meaning to hide. From this word also derives our words skin and hide, the latter in both its meanings. As Nathanson points out in The Many Faces of Shame, the skin or the hide is our natural covering, that within which we seek cover. He says, we learn to hide first for the sake of shame and later for protection from physical danger. And the shame is the affective reaction that is characteristic of shame is a blush, which is another intersubjective thing. As you can see that by this quote from Darwin, it's by thinking of what other people think of us that produces a blush. And our characteristic reaction is to hide our blush, to hide our face when it's red. Okay. So back to disgust. What is very interesting about disgust for my rhetorical purposes is that it's among the most communicable of affective reactions. So as William Ian Miller again argues, quote, the feelings of love and regret are not as easily definable as the feelings of disgust. Disgust thus communicates rather better than most emotions. Because of the communicable nature of disgust, it is thus particularly good as a builder of communities. Miller writes that disgust builds communities, quote, by helping define and locate the boundary separating our group from their group, purity from pollution, the violable from the inviolable. It does so also as a consequence of its capacity for being readily experienced vicariously. Disgust, like indignation, is something we experience as much upon hearing and seeing offenses done to another as those done to ourselves. Disgust and indignation unite the world of impartial spectators into a moral community as co-sharers of the same sentiments, as guardians of propriety and purity. These sentiments supply the motivation for punishing certain kinds of offenses. End quote. So this, what Miller is talking about, may help to explain the inclination of affective reactions like disgust and judgment, like we've seen in these public shaming instances, to go viral in social media contexts, and hence why these public shaming events are so powerful. We can most readily experience in parallel the feeling of, in this case, moral disgust, unlike nicer but perhaps vaguer feelings. Though this is something that I don't have time to talk about here, but it's interesting to me to watch the efforts of sites like Upworthy, which are trying to make nice content go viral, and in fact that's working very well. So but they really have to work at it. It takes a team of 40 people to make content that makes you feel good go viral, as opposed to these public shaming instances where people like to gang up and judge others' behavior. Apparently, comes more naturally to us, whether that's good or bad. Okay, so combining with the potency of disgust as a communicable affect is the nature of crowds. These two factors, along with the technological affordances of social media, I want to argue, create perfect conditions for these public shaming events. So let's talk about crowds first. The internet presents a historically unique crowd formation. Internet technology, as even the earliest web theorists noted, makes it possible for enormous groups of people to do things together. Alias Canetti's remarkable book Crowds and Power, which though it was published well before the internet, provides a helpful way to think about these internet crowds, I think. So in Canetti's estimation, crowds are these supra-organic beings that have particular movements and desires over and above those of the individual participants in a crowd. Different kinds of crowds form for different purposes, but all types of crowds strive involuntarily towards some kind of peak event, which Canetti terms a discharge. You can laugh at that if you're as juvenile as I am. The crowds that form spontaneously in public shaming events, like the ones I described earlier, correspond most directly with what Canetti calls the baiting crowd, a crowd that forms for the purposes of taking someone down, either literally or, in the case of these public shaming events, in terms of reputation and economic stability. The formation of the baiting crowd doesn't require physical presence. Canetti points out that such a crowd can be formed through media technology. As he says, today everyone takes part in public executions through the newspapers. Canetti wrote Crowds and Power in an era of centrally broadcast media like televisions and newspapers. The interface of these media creates an essentially passive role for the audience who can participate only in limited ways, by discussing the day's reported events with people in their vicinity, or at most by writing letters to the editor. Canetti clearly finds the vicarious participation of these newspaper reading crowds insufficient. He writes somewhat scathingly, "One is tempted to say that it is the most despicable and at the same time the most stable form of such a crowd." Now, of course, the technological interface of social media like Twitter not only allows for but encourages participation. What's more, dealings on the internet are characterized by a psychological phenomenon called de-individuation, in which anonymity removes social responsibility and encourages people to act in ways they ordinarily wouldn't. As a recent Guardian article reports, anonymous commenters on blogs and other sites that allow for online commenting get a kind of pack mentality. So I want to argue that Canetti's theory of crowds here can help us better grasp the performative dimension of Epideictic. As Canetti argues, humans strive to maintain the sense of individual boundary that begins and ends with their skin. This desire to feel oneself an individual expresses itself most clearly as a revulsion toward the touch of others, what we might think of as the rubbing up against the boundaries of individuals, which by the very sensitivity of these boundaries serves as a reminder both of this state of individuality and also of the simultaneous and countervailing desire to shed those boundaries, lose the sense of individual boundedness, and be swept along with something greater. What we might think of, what I argue, is an originary sociality, something that exists before individuality and that in fact defines us. So individuality is an effect. We don't start off as a collection of individuals. We start off from some primal sociality, and individuality gets created along the way. So that density, as Canetti describes it, where there is scarcely any space between, where body presses against body, and each man is as near the other as he is to himself. The press of bodies of skin rubbing past skin, writes Canetti, makes it possible to momentarily overcome hierarchies. Like the other organic event to which this term applies, the moment of discharge in a crowd is pleasurable an immense feeling of relief. In this moment, the feeling of being alone inside one's own bag of skin, as Alan Watts would put it, is temporarily interrupted, and one recalls one's true state, a primordial togetherness. Though, of course, online there is no actual rubbing of skin against skin, the same urge to become a crowd still applies. Individuals show their beliefs about what's okay and not okay by enacting them as a crowd through acts of collected, distributed shaming, say. So, as compared to the old understanding of Epideictic, in which the affirmation of community values is understood to be the province of the individual speaker, this new form of Epideictic cements community values through the very act of becoming a crowd. The end.